Welcome to my YouTube channel, Rick Surowicz Watercolor. This is the narrated step-by-step tutorial for my painting, Brighter Days. The photograph on the right was the reference for my painting. You can see that my interpretation was not an attempt to copy the photograph. This photograph was simply a photograph I took in my studio of a container of daisies. I used the reference photo to give me an idea of some of the positioning of the flowers and some of the major shapes. I took some of the linear stem shapes and put them in the composition. But from there on, I made it my own composition and my own interpretation. Before I begin, I'll review the colors that I used in the painting. Hansa yellow, quinacridone gold, cerulean blue, cobalt blue, royal blue, sap green, quinacridone burnt orange, raw umber, pyrrole red, and quinacridone rose madder. I begin by putting down a wash of Hansa yellow. It's a nice lemony color, and your color has its greatest intensity when it's placed over the white of the paper. Once you start to put other pigments down, you lose the intensity of the paints that you put down, so the color is going to be its very brightest when it's put on the white paper. So I wanted to have this this bright lemony wash in the center of these flowers, and I'm giving a suggestion of some daisies here in the distance, and I'm going to pick a little bit of that up in farther up in the top right where there's a center of a flower there. But you can see that it's a very bright yellow, and I use that fine mist spray to help diffuse that color because it goes from the center and it carries out onto some of the petals there. So I'm just putting this wash on early because I can't come back later and get this nice bright lemony yellow because I'll lose that intensity once the white paper is gone. And here's the other area where I'm just putting in a light wash, and I want to keep a clean edge on the left side there because you're seeing around a petal into the center of the flower, where the one on the bottom you're catching the whole open flower. So just a touch of this lemon color, this lemon Hansa yellow, just to get me started. I'm going to add some yellow in a few other places here where you'll be able to see some of that yellow peeking through. And while my photograph doesn't actually have any of this bright yellow over here on the right side in the photograph, I'm going to put some yellow in here just to help balance my composition. I'm just giving a suggestion there could be some more daisies back there, even though I don't have that in my photograph. I'm going to take some quinacridone gold, and I'm going to put it over top of the center of this flower where I've already put this bright yellow mixture. I have a little quinacridone burnt orange in there also. You can see this is a very fluid mixture. There's quite a bit of water in it, but there's also quite a bit of pigment, so it's still a very strong tone that I'm putting down there. And one of the reasons I want to have it fairly wet is I want to create texture in the center of this. So I've put this very wet wash down here, loaded with moisture, and now I'm going to sprinkle some salt, some coarse salt, into that mixture. And then I'll let it dry and then rub it off, and it's going to give me that texture that I'm after. I want to make sure that I have enough water in there so that it will help move some of that paint around. It flows around the salt crystals. So I'm actually going to spritz that a little bit too with a coarse spray of water. Get a little bit more water in there. If it's not wet, that paint isn't going to move around the crystals. And what happens when you remove that where that salt is going to come off, and you'll see some of the lighter tones that were first applied, and that darker quinacridone gold will have moved around those salt crystals, creating the texture. Now I've thoroughly dried this with a hairdryer, and I'm going to rub off those crystals of salt using a tissue in my hand. And you can see now that it's created a nice texture in these areas where that was applied. And you can see in the larger flower there that those lighter washes that I put down are coming through, because the areas underneath the salt crystals are going to remain fairly close to that first wash, while that quinacridone golden orange is in the area that moved around those salt crystals. So I have these kind of yellow tones down, and I want to start to bring in some cooler blue tones, a little bit of violet, some light violet tones, maybe some red violet. And I'm not going to really put the photograph in here to refer to, because I'm really not using that anymore. I used it to get some ideas for my drawing, for my composition and positioning of the flowers, but I'm really going to make this painting my own. So I'm just going to start putting down some washes, some colors, start to define some edges, positive and negative edges, and start to put some areas in shadow, start to deepen some values, and start to bring out some areas forward, push other areas back. I'll start to work in a variety of shapes. But this is really just working kind of with design principles and not trying to copy a photograph. So I've started with some cerulean blue, and I'll work in some cobalt blue. I'll take some quinacridone rose madder, mix it with a little bit of the cobalt to give me a violet and a red violet tone, and I'll just put some touches of that into some of the washes that I'm putting down. And this is all very light value at this moment, so I've mixed in a little bit of that rose madder. It's quinacridone rose madder, and you can see now I have a violet tone that I'm putting into that wash, and that plays well with the yellow tones that I've put down. And as I work through the painting process, I'm going to apply a variety of washes, and I'll be drying my paper a number of times throughout the painting process as I build the layers and as I build my values and I start to carve out shapes and edges. As I paint this, I don't want to have it in the end where all I have is a bunch of white petals and a background painted around it. There's going to be some of these petals are going to cast in shadow and have various colors reflecting onto it, and I want to play with some of these violet yellow relationships and the blue and a little bit of the orangey tone relationship in the quinacridone burnt orange and the quinacridone gold. And as I develop this, I'm just going to work around my painting, and by painting in both positive and negative space, I'll start to define edges, which will in turn define some of these shapes. And my values is the play of value is where I'm really going to start to get the feeling of depth in the composition. Changing colors doesn't really help you build depth. You really need to change values. You can change colors and values together, certainly, but the key there is changing the values. So having a variety of light and darks and getting overlap and starting to position darks strategically so that some things are pushed back while other areas are coming forward. But right now I'm just trying to create some variety on the petals of the flower, and I'll just gradually add these washes, and I'll dry my paper and I'll add more and build over top of some of these. To this point, a lot of the washes that I've put down and the tones I've put down have been very specific to, say, a petal or a space between a petal. But now I'm going to take some of that wash and just take it over a general area. So it's like reflected light, reflected color and value that's going over a larger area. So here's a series of petals that are being impacted by the wash that I'm putting down. So this isn't unique to one petal or the other, as I was doing here to start. These washes are covering over multiple petals at the same time. Because of the arrangement, such as it is, you'll have shadows going in multiple directions. Now I'm going to take some of these same colors and values I've been working with and move up to this other significant flower that's in the composition. And I'm just going to glaze over some of those petals and tone some of them down. And I'll use these washes to help define some of the edges. If you have a good understanding of moisture content and know what to expect when you put brush to paper under different conditions, and if you have a good understanding of value contrast, how to use it effectively, and if you understand how to develop edges, a variety of edges, hard edges, soft edges, lost and found edges, broken edges, then you're well on your way to being able to create successful paintings. The flip side of that is when you don't have an understanding of the things I just mentioned, that's when I think your paintings fall short of their potential, and it's also some of the things that lead to frustration when people are working with watercolor or trying to learn watercolor. Now I'm going to start to work with a variety of warm and cool green tones to start to paint some of these areas that are underneath these flowers. So I'm working with a mixture of sap green and royal blue, and when I mix those two together, it'll give me, depending on the ratios, a cooler green or blue green. And when I want that color not to be quite as raw, I want to move it a little bit more towards neutral, I'll take and add a little bit of pyrrole red, and sometimes I'll add a little bit of quinacridone and burnt orange. And you can see hopefully in this wash that I've just put down how there's some green, some blue green, and actually some blue tones in there. So that royal blue does a nice job to cool that sap green. It'll move it a little bit towards the blue side. And when I want it to be a little more neutral, I'll add a little quinacridone burnt orange or pyrrole red. If the mixture is leaning more towards the sap green, if it has a higher ratio or higher percentage of sap green in my mixture and it's more of a green and I want to neutralize it, I'm more likely to add some pyrrole red. But if it's heading more towards a blue-green and I wanted to neutralize it a little bit, I'm more likely to add some quinacridone burnt orange. I'll add the color that's closer to being directly across the color wheel and closer to a complement to help drive it towards neutral. So that's why I use more of the red tone when it's leaning towards green and more of the orange tone when it's leaning more towards a blue-green. I'm going to keep working with these same color mixtures, and I'm just working my way around this this daisy here, and I'm working in negative space here. I'm working off the exterior edge of the flower. So right now I'm defining the flower by painting the space around it rather than actually painting the flower itself. So I'm working in negative space. And I'm starting to go a little darker with my value, but I'm still not really very dark. I'm really not much beyond middle value anywhere in my painting. And this is an area where often, as I had mentioned earlier, if you have a good understanding of values and value contrast, this is the range that a lot of people work in until they really get a good handle on value and value contrast. And this is where I feel sometimes people don't realize their full potential of their painting and their composition because they don't fully explore the value range, and they stop without going much darker than a middle value or a dark middle value. They don't really go the full range of dark values. And that's where really you start to get some pop into your painting and start to feel depth. And you can use those strong contrasts to help create a center of interest and move the viewer around your page. And really, for creating depth, it's essential to be able to use some dark values and have some contrast. You'll notice as I paint this, some of these areas are just little touches of value to define an edge. And I'm not outlining these flower petals. I'm defining the edges and defining space and shape. Some of them are small shapes, some are larger shapes, some are very linear, some are not linear. So what I'm trying to do here is define this composition by painting shapes that help define edges, and I'm not trying to just outline these flowers, even though this green kind of goes around this whole flower in the lower left hand corner. It's not my intention just to put a green outline around the whole flower. I'm putting in a variety of shapes and using those shapes to define edges, which in turn define the shapes of the petals of the flowers. And you can see how sometimes when I want a soft edge, I use that fine mist spray to achieve that. In my interpretation here, I wanted to get a suggestion of this kind of sky blue color so that you're looking at these daisies and they have this nice kind of a sky blue sky in the background here. So I have a wash of cerulean blue, and I'm using this soft wash brush here. It's a jumbo round small brush, and I'm going to apply this wash, and you can see I'm still working in negative space here. I'm starting to define some of the edges of those flowers by putting in this blue wash, and here you can see I'm softening that. And I'm going to take my wash brush and I'm going to just block in some more color here. So these are fairly flat washes, but when I hit it with that spray bottle, you can see I start to get some gradation there. And this is a part of me making this my own painting. Obviously my photo didn't have a blue sky behind there. It's a vase of flowers sitting in my studio that I took a picture of. And this is where there's a level of creativity on how you want to interpret your scene and what ultimately you want your painting to suggest. And here I have these daisies, and I want this to feel more like it's outside, and you've got the leaves and the stems and all this greenery underneath them, and you have this kind of a nice sky blue sky here in the distance, and you're looking at kind of a bright sunny day. I'm going to carry this wash down in the lower left hand or right hand corner around some of these shapes. And for this painting, I'm only going to be working with two brushes. I have this wash brush, which is a round wash brush. It's a squirrel synthetic blend. And then I'll be using my quill brush, which I've used when I was putting in some of those shadows, and that's a brush that has a nice point but a body that holds quite a bit of paint in it. So this painting will be done using just those two brushes. I have this large leafy shape here, and I'm going to paint that with a green that's leaning a little bit more towards the warm side. So this is kind of sticking out here away from some of the activity, some of these other the flowers and leaves, and it perhaps is catching some of that light, so it's a warmer green tone that I'm using. And this is sap green, and it's toned down just a little bit with some pyrrole red, not a lot, just a little bit, and just put in a nice kind of a a flat wash at this point over this leaf shape. And you can see that I've painted around that linear stem shape that's coming over top the leaf. So while I'm painting the leaf as a positive shape, there's still positive negative relationships, because the leaf, as it relates to that stem that's going over top of it, the leaf shape is negative as it relates to that stem, but it's positive as it relates to, say, the blue background and some of the other things that will be going on underneath it. You've heard me mention value many times already in this video, and if you've seen my other videos, you know that I often talk about value. So here I have a kind of a value checker that I have, and as I go around this painting at this point, I really haven't fully explored the value range. If I cover up the darkest part of the value range and go around, you'll see that even the darkest areas I have, say right there, they don't really go much beyond middle value to a dark middle value. Right there is a fairly dark blue, but it's still a middle value. And if I take my hand to the other side and I show the darkest values, you can see I don't have any values that come close in my painting at this stage of the painting process. And this is why I say sometimes people don't fully reach their potential, because they fail to explore the value range. They don't go much beyond this point, and this isn't dark enough. This doesn't have enough contrast in it to be a strong painting at this stage. Yet there are some that would stop right here. I want to continue with this blue wash. Again, this is a fairly flat wash that I'm putting down of cerulean blue, and I want to further define some of these shapes by blocking in some more of this color. This is a fairly large area, and this is the quill brush that I was talking about. Even though it comes to a very nice point, you can see it still holds quite a bit of paint. So it's a very versatile brush. So I can take that up to a nice point, but I can use it also to fill in and block in that shape. Now I'm going to take a mixture of some raw umber and some sap green, and I'll also put in a little bit of burnt orange, the quinacridone burnt orange, and I'm going to put that around the center of this flower, because there's this dark area that gets created here around the flower, and then it gradates out. So I'm going to put touches of this kind of a dark valued green mixture in here, and I'm going to spray it away from the center with a fine mist spray, and I'm just going to let that color diffuse over those flower petals. So at this point I'm still not much darker than a middle value, but now I'm going to start to come up with a much darker mixture. So you can see that I'm going to start to get some stronger contrast here. And the color I'm using is the same green mixtures that I was using earlier, the kind of the sap green, royal blue, and sometimes leaning more towards sap green, sometimes leaning more towards a blue green. But it's a much darker value mixture that I'm using, and there's a lot more pigment in the mixture than there was, and this royal blue is a very dark valued pigment, so I can add that to my sap green and I can get a very nice dark blue green tone. This is a point in the painting process that I enjoy, where you just kind of do some shape making, and you can see that I have dark linear shapes that stop on the edge of the flower and pick up on the other side, and then that suggests overlap, and that helps create depth in the painting. So you can see these linear shapes that by painting around the edge of these stems that are underneath the flower, I start to define those shapes, and at the same time I'm starting to define a little bit more the edges of the daisies themselves. So by bringing in those dark linear shapes here, they stop on the edge of the flower, so they help define an edge on the edge of the flower petal, but they also start to describe light and dark shapes that are moving underneath the flower itself. So I'll carry that overlap and those shifting of dark and light values around the composition, and that's what's going to help start to build depth. You can see in some of these flowers, they're just little touches of value to suggest a little bit of space between the petals that you can see some of the dark values beneath. But this is also where you start to push some areas of the composition back in space, and it starts to in turn send some of the other areas forward. As I work my way around this, I pick and choose what areas or what shapes I want to move forward and what areas I want to push back. And then sometimes there will be a particular shape that I want to break up, and I'll bring a linear shape over top of it. And as this develops, I'll start to do some lifting and start to create some more linear shapes that help create some more movement in my composition. So again, I'm not looking at any photo as I do this. I just call it shape making. And if you've seen a number of my videos, you've heard me over and over and over talk about shapes, talk about value. Hopefully you can see in the areas that I've started to bring in these dark values, you're starting to get a sense of depth in the composition, where if you look in the other areas where I haven't put any of these darker values, you don't have that same feeling of depth. There's also a greater sense of overlap in these areas where I've put in these dark values. I've brought these dark green tones up to this other daisy, and I've started to further define the shape of that flower, because I'm starting to define the edges of it by working in negative space around it off the negative edge. I often refer to the exterior edge of a shape as a negative edge. I'm going to touch some of this darker value right along this leaf. As it kind of curls up, it gets a dark shadowed edge to it. I'm going to go back to my wash brush, and I'm going to put a darker wash over top of this large leaf shape. And as I do this, I'm going to start to carry this green tone into that stem that's going over top of it. As the painting evolves, I'll still have that stem shape. I won't lose it, and you'll see as I go farther along, and I'm going to do some lifting. But I want to carry that off the leaf. I want to carry that off the page, that shape. And I'm going to start to put this green tone over top of some of these other linear shapes I have here that are suggesting that there's some stems back here. And as I paint the stems that I'm painting right now, I'm not overly happy with the position of the end of the flower petal as it relates to the stem. It's a bit of a tangent. I don't like how it lines up in the center and kind of follows it. And better if it was offset a little bit, but the point of the petal isn't on the edge of the stem, which would really bother me. But I think I'm just going to leave it as it is. As I paint these, you can see I'm not trying to render these with a teeny tiny brush. I'm just making fairly expressive brush strokes with this wash brush, and that's enough. I don't have to render every square inch of my painting. I don't want to. I don't want the same level of detail everywhere. I'm going to take my quill brush and I'm going to paint the base of this other daisy here. And it'll help define this petal of this daisy that's in the foreground here a little bit better. So all these washes of green that I've been putting down are combinations of sap green, royal blue, and pyro red. And every now and then there might be a touch of quinacridone burnt orange. I've decided I want this smaller leaf shape here to be darker value. So I'm going to paint this pretty much a flat wash, a flat dark value. And it helps balance this the distribution of this value across the composition. As you move to the left, and you see in that left corner how I have this dark value, then it moves across the page and it's picked up over here, and I just feel that's a better situation than if I left that at that kind of a lighter, brighter value. I want to have a few darker values around the center of this flower, and I want a few harder edges. Right now it's all very soft edge. So I'm going to come in here with this dark value and just put some touches here. I didn't go just draw a line around it in a half circle. This line of value here, I'll call it, is broken up. It doesn't there's areas where it's interrupted as it moves around there. So it's not just an outline of the center of the flower. I want to create a stronger sense of depth in some of these areas. I'm bringing in a darker value in between some of these petals, so you can kind of see through them and you start to feel that depth and some more of that suggestion of overlap. Right now all these petals kind of look the same to me, and I want to take part of this flower and make it look like it's more of it's in shadow than the other. So I'm taking this wash of cobalt blue and I'm going over top of some of the petals here. I'm going to take some of the cobalt blue now, and I'm going to move up to the other daisy here, and I'm going to glaze over top of some of that too, just to push it back a little bit from the edge of this other daisy that's in the foreground. I'm going to glaze over this area in the top left corner a little bit, tone that down, and give a little bit more unity to the painting. So I have that kind of a cobalt blue wash that's coming over that area and down onto that flower. Now my painting is thoroughly dried, and I'm going to take a brush that I like to use for lifting. I said I was only using 2 brushes to paint with, but I am using this nylon brush to do some lifting. And this is a 3/4 inch brush. It's nylon. It has a nice edge on it, and I'm not really sure where I got it, but it does a really nice job at cutting through the paint and lifting. And this cold pressed paper that I work on is Lanaquarel. It's pretty good for lifting on, and especially when you're lifting some of the darker values. And I like to drag that color. I'll lift it and I'll move that pigment a little bit and go over top of some of the lighter areas. So I go from a light on a dark to a dark over a light sometimes by dragging that color. But I like to do some of this lifting, and I feel it gives some motion to the composition and helps give us a feeling of direction. So I'll take this brush and I'll do some of this lifting, and I'll blot it gently with a tissue to help remove some of that agitated pigment. And I'll just do this here and there and where I feel it can help. and sometimes I'll start and stop just to help to increase the feeling of overlap. So I'll stop on the edge and pick it up on another edge sometimes. I want to go darker with the base of this flower, and it's going to help also strengthen the edge of the petal of this daisy in the foreground as I paint this. And I'm going to do this with a quill brush, and this is a mixture that has the royal blue and the sap green, but also a little bit of the quinacridone burnt orange in it, so that it's not so much of a blue-green. Just want to darken that. You can see how that helps sharpen the edge of that flower by painting that dark value around it. And the same is true of the shape that I'm painting right now. That dark value strengthens the edge of this other petal to the right of that. And again, that helps create more of a feeling of depth and overlap. When I get to this point in a painting like this, I'll tend to go around the painting and just make some precise dark valued shapes. And I place them in areas where I feel I can strengthen an edge or create a little more overlap or strengthen an area of interest. And I just feel that it helps bring a little bit of pop to the painting and makes it a little bit more dynamic, makes it stand out a little bit more. And I just think that these finishing touches with some dark value in the right places just really can enhance the painting. I've been moving around the painting, putting in some of these touches of value, and on this left side I just feel there's not enough depth there. I want to just create a few more areas of interest, give the suggestion that you're looking through in a few areas here, and I do that by a careful placement of some of these dark values. Here I suggest a dark linear shape moving behind this flower. I'm going to have some of these dark value linear shapes going behind what I have here in the composition already. So I'm going to stop and start on the edge of these areas I lifted off, and by doing that I further define the edge of those linear marks that I lifted, and it helps validate the strength of that shape that I've lifted off. Sometimes the lifting doesn't give a crisp edge, but you can come in and put some nice brush marks in that help define some edges, and then the eye will help continue that on for the rest of the shape. Here I'm just going to put a few touches of dark value with a little bit of line on some of these linear shapes to help strengthen that shape, the area that I lifted off, and just put some touches of values in a couple other places here. I'm going to go a little darker on this leaf, and I'm going to paint around some of these areas that I've lifted off. So by doing so, working in negative space around them, I strengthen those shapes that I lifted off with a nylon brush. And I'm going to take a little water, I'm going to soften that, gradate that out to the edge. That lifting that I do with a nylon brush gives me some different shapes to work with. As I lift and I go over top of some of the lines and I come in with another area where I lift, you can see all the shapes that are created by that. And then I play up those shapes by coming back in with a glaze and painting around them, and that strengthens the areas that I lifted off and helps give some more contrast between the leaf and those shapes. want a little bit more of the darker value in this area, so I'm going to come in, I'm going to give the suggestion of a small leaf shape that's working its way behind some of these stems and the flowers, the flower that's here in the foreground. So I stop on the edge of this stem and put a touch of value there and come out the other side. So now it looks like that is behind the various linear shapes there, and creates the overlap and the depth. And a little bit more of that value here to help balance my composition. I'm going to come in here with a dark value leaf shape again, and you can see how I'm painting around what I already have there. So once again, building overlap and creating depth. Now I'm going to put a mat around this to get rid of the tape and the board. And there you have my painting, Brighter Days.